Mark stood in front of the mirror, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the tie that he had borrowed from his father's old wardrobe. It had been a while since anyone had touched the dusty, faded drawer that held remnants of his father's life. Ties, cufflinks, watches that hadn't ticked in years. The burgundy tie felt stiff between his fingers, and the air around him seemed heavier than usual, the memories of his father lingering like ghosts in the small, dimly lit apartment. Today was a big day, one of those defining moments in a person's life where everything hinges on a single decision, a single interview, a single chance. Mark had rehearsed every possible answer to every imaginable question that might come his way. He had spent nights studying the company's profile, researching its history, its vision, and the background of the man who would sit across from him, Robert Hensley, the CEO of Hensley & Company, a name that loomed large in the city's business circles. This was his dream job, the stepping stone that could catapult him from his modest beginnings into a life of success, stability, and fulfillment. The mere thought of it sent a rush of adrenaline through his veins. But there was more than just ambition fueling his determination today. As Mark stood there, lost in his thoughts, his eyes drifted to the small, ornate jewelry box on the corner of his dresser. He hadn't opened that box in years, not since she died. His mother's delicate gold necklace lay inside, coiled softly like a sleeping serpent, its surface glinting faintly under the weak morning light. The pendant attached to it was simple, a tiny locket with an intricate floral engraving, something that had been passed down through generations from mother to daughter. Mark's mother had been the last owner, and now it sat there, forgotten, gathering dust. He had never worn it, never even considered it. It had always seemed like a sacred object, something far too precious for the everyday chaos of life. But today, as the weight of the interview bore down on him, Mark felt a strange pull towards it. He wasn't superstitious by nature, but there was something about today that made him long for a connection, for a sense of comfort and guidance. His mother had always been his anchor, the steady hand that calmed his restless spirit. She had believed in him, even when he couldn't see his own potential. "You're destined for great things," she would often say, her voice warm and soothing, like the scent of lavender that always clung to her clothes. When she passed away, Mark had felt lost, adrift in a world that suddenly seemed too big and too cold. Her death had been sudden, a cruel twist of fate that left him grappling with grief and questions that would never have answers. The necklace had been one of the few things he had kept, a token of her unwavering love and belief in him. On a whim, he reached for the box, his fingers hesitant as they lifted the lid. The necklace felt cool against his skin as he picked it up, its familiar weight somehow grounding him. For a moment, he simply stood there, staring at the pendant, lost in the memory of his mother's smile. Would she have worn it today? If she were still here, would she have smiled at him, straightened his tie, and whispered words of encouragement? The thought brought a lump to his throat, and before he could second-guess himself, Mark slipped the necklace over his head, tucking the pendant beneath his shirt. It wasn't visible, but he could feel it resting against his chest, a silent reminder that she was still with him in some small way. It wasn't luck he was seeking. It was her presence, her strength. The clock on the wall ticked relentlessly, pulling him back to the present. It was time to leave. Mark grabbed his worn leather briefcase, the one that had accompanied him through countless job fairs, interviews, and rejections. He took a deep breath, trying to calm the nervous energy that bubbled just beneath the surface. He had prepared for this moment, but no amount of preparation could quell the anxiety that gnawed at his stomach. As he stepped out of the apartment, the cool autumn air hit him, crisp and refreshing, carrying with it the scent of wet leaves and distant rain. The city was alive with its usual hustle and bustle. Cars honking, people rushing to work, the sound of a street musician playing a melancholy tune on the corner. But Mark was lost in his own world, his thoughts swirling around the upcoming interview. He walked briskly, each step bringing him closer to the towering glass building that housed Hensley & Company. The skyscraper loomed ahead, its sleek design a stark contrast to the old, weathered streets of the neighborhood where Mark had grown up. As a child, he had often stared at such buildings, marveling at the lives of the people who worked there. People in sharp suits, carrying briefcases, important conversations flowing effortlessly as they moved through the corridors of power. Now, he was on the verge of becoming one of them. But beneath the surface, Mark's confidence was fraying. The fear of failure, the nagging doubt that maybe he wasn't good enough, gnawed at him with every passing second. He clenched his fists inside the pockets of his coat, his knuckles white from the pressure. He had been through interviews before, plenty of them, but none had felt as significant as this one. This was the opportunity that could change everything. The elevator ride up to the 35th floor felt like an eternity. Mark watched the numbers climb slowly, his heart racing in tandem with the ascending digits. The hum of the elevator was the only sound in the confined space, and for a moment, he closed his eyes, taking slow, deliberate breaths to steady himself. The necklace, hidden beneath his shirt, felt warm against his skin, as if his mother's spirit was offering him silent encouragement. "You can do this," he whispered to himself, the words barely audible. "You've prepared for this." When the elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, Mark stepped out onto the polished marble floor of Hensley & Company. The reception area was sleek and modern, with glass walls that offered a breathtaking view of the city below. But Mark barely noticed the view. His focus was on the task ahead, on the man he was about to meet, the man who held his future in his hands. The receptionist, a woman with sharp features and a professional smile, directed him to a waiting area where he sat, hands clasped tightly in his lap. His foot tapped nervously against the floor, the sound muffled by the thick carpet beneath his shoes. The minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. Mark could feel the weight of the necklace, a constant reminder of why he was here, of the promises he had made to himself and to the memory of his mother. He wouldn't let her down. He couldn't. When the door to the office finally opened, and a tall man in an impeccably tailored suit stepped out, Mark felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. His moment had arrived. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Robert Hensley down the long, polished corridor. The rhythmic sound of their footsteps echoed against the walls, a steady, almost ominous beat that mirrored the anxiety bubbling inside him. The towering man ahead of him, Robert, exuded an air of authority, confidence practically radiating from him. His posture was immaculate, his steps deliberate and slow, as though he was completely in control of both time and space. Mark could barely keep his breath steady. His palms were slick with sweat despite the cool air in the building. The weight of the necklace beneath his shirt seemed heavier than before, the thin gold chain almost burning against his skin. His fingers twitched at his sides, yearning to grasp the pendant as though holding it would somehow transfer his mother's strength to him. The office of Robert Hensley, CEO of Hensley & Company, was at the very end of the hallway, a sleek glass door framed by brushed steel panels. It was the type of office you only ever saw in movies or high-end business magazines, minimalist and modern, every detail sharp and deliberate. The world beyond that door was unfamiliar territory for Mark, a far cry from the humble life he had known. As they approached the office, Robert slowed his pace, glancing back at Mark over his shoulder, his expression unreadable. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Mark felt a cold shiver run down his spine. There was something about the man's gaze, piercing and calculating, as if he could see through the layers of bravado Mark had built up over the years, as if he already knew Mark's story before a single word had been spoken. "Take a seat, Mr. Collins," Robert said, his voice smooth but firm as he gestured toward a pair of leather chairs placed across from his enormous oak desk. Mark swallowed hard, nodding as he stepped into the office. The room was as grand as the rest of the building, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city skyline. The desk was immaculate, not a single paper out of place, the surface reflecting the warm light filtering in through the tinted glass. The walls were adorned with minimalist art, the kind Mark didn't quite understand but assumed was expensive. Behind the desk, a large bookcase stretched from one end of the wall to the other, filled with thick volumes on business strategy, economics, and the occasional philosophy book, testaments to Robert's intellect and, likely, his ego. Mark sat down slowly, the leather creaking slightly beneath him. His body was stiff, the tension in his muscles making it difficult to relax. His gaze flickered toward Robert, who had taken his place behind the desk, watching Mark with an intense, almost predatory gaze. There was a brief silence as Robert adjusted the cuffs of his shirt, his movements precise and deliberate. Mark could feel the weight of the man's scrutiny, as if every twitch, every breath, every blink was being analyzed. So, Robert began, his voice low and commanding, "Tell me, Mark, why do you want to work at Hensley & Company?" The question, though simple, felt loaded, like the beginning of a test Mark hadn't quite prepared for. He had anticipated this question, of course, had rehearsed the perfect answer in front of the mirror a dozen times. But now, sitting here under the gaze of this formidable man, the words felt clumsy, inadequate. Mark took a breath, forcing himself to maintain eye contact. Hensley & Company it's one of the most respected companies in the industry, he began, his voice steady but his heart racing. It's known for its innovative approach, its commitment to excellence, and the way it pushes the boundaries of what's possible in the market. I've followed the company's growth for years, and I believe that with my skills and passion, I can contribute to that vision. It sounded rehearsed, even to his own ears, but it was the truth. Hensley & Company had always been a symbol of success, a beacon in the world of finance and investment. Working here would be the culmination of everything Mark had worked for, everything his mother had believed in. Robert raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface of his desk. "And what makes you think you're different from the hundreds of other applicants we receive every day? Why should we choose you?" Mark felt his throat tighten. This was the part that always tripped him up in interviews, the part where he had to sell himself, to make them believe that he was special, that he was worth the risk. He knew he had to stand out, but what could he say that hadn't already been said by 100 others who had sat in this same chair? "I don't just want a job," Mark said, his voice firmer this time. "I want a career. I want to grow with the company, to learn from the best, and to push myself beyond what I thought was possible. I know I don't have the same level of experience as some of the other candidates, but I'm a quick learner, and I'm not afraid to work hard. I'm dedicated, and I'm willing to put in whatever it takes to succeed." It was honest, and he hoped that would be enough. He didn't have the impressive resume of others. He didn't come from a prestigious background or have a long list of accolades to boast about. All he had was his determination, his drive, and the memory of his mother's belief in him. Robert remained silent for a moment, his fingers still drumming softly on the desk. His eyes bore into Mark as though he was trying to peel back the layers of his words to see if there was any substance beneath the surface. The silence was suffocating, and Mark resisted the urge to fidget, to shift uncomfortably under the weight of Robert's scrutiny. Finally, Robert leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms over his chest. "Ambition is a good thing, Mark," he said slowly, his tone measured. "But ambition without results is meaningless. Here at Hensley & Company, we don't reward potential. We reward performance. What you think you can do is irrelevant. What matters is what you've done." Mark's heart sank slightly at the words, though he fought to keep his expression neutral. He had expected this. He had known going in that his lack of experience would be a hurdle, but hearing it out loud, from the man whose approval he so desperately needed, made it feel like a mountain. "I understand," Mark said quietly, his fingers gripping the armrest of the chair. "But I'm ready to prove myself. I know I can contribute to this company if given the chance." Robert's gaze flickered briefly to the gold chain peeking out from the collar of Mark's shirt. His eyes narrowed slightly, though his expression remained otherwise unchanged. "Tell me something, Mark," he said, leaning forward slightly. "What drives you? Why this job? Why this company? What's at stake for you?" Mark hesitated, caught off guard by the question. He had expected the usual interview questions about his qualifications, his experience, his knowledge of the industry. But this felt more personal, more probing, as though Robert was searching for something deeper, something more than just a rehearsed answer. For a moment, Mark considered giving the safe, professional response. Something about career growth, financial security, the opportunity to work with the best in the business. But as he sat there, under the weight of Robert's gaze, he felt the necklace against his skin once more, its presence a constant reminder of everything he had lost, everything he had fought for. "My mother," Mark said, his voice quiet but steady. She always believed in me. Even when I didn't believe in myself, she worked so hard to give me the chance to pursue my dreams. She sacrificed so much. When she passed away, I promised myself that I would make her proud, that I would succeed not just for me, but for her. That's what drives me. That's what's at stake." Robert's expression remained unreadable, but Mark could see something shift in his eyes. A flicker of something, maybe understanding, maybe curiosity. The silence stretched between them, heavy and tense, and Mark could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. After what felt like an eternity, Robert leaned back in his chair once more, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "I see," he said softly, his voice thoughtful. "Family. It's a powerful motivator." Mark nodded, though he wasn't sure if his answer had been the right one. He had bared a piece of his soul in that moment, shared something deeply personal, but whether it had resonated with Robert or not was impossible to tell. The interview continued, with Robert asking more technical questions about market trends, investment strategies, hypothetical scenarios. Mark did his best to answer each one thoughtfully, drawing on everything he had studied, everything he had prepared for. But the weight of that earlier question still hung in the air, lingering like a shadow over the rest of the conversation. As the interview drew to a close, Mark could feel his nerves starting to fray once more. He had done his best, but whether that would be enough, he couldn't say. He had put everything on the table, his skills, his ambition, his personal motivations. Now, all that was left was to wait. Robert stood, signaling the end of the interview, and extended his hand to Mark. "Thank you for coming in today, Mr. Collins," he said, his tone polite but distant. "We'll be in touch." Mark's legs felt like lead as he walked out of Robert Hensley's office. The interview had ended, but it had left him suspended in a state of uncertainty. His mind was racing, replaying every word, every question, every slight change in Robert's expression. He felt like he had given everything he could, had laid his heart bare in that room, and yet, as the door closed behind him, there was still no sense of relief. The receptionist gave him a brief smile as he passed by, but it felt distant, almost mechanical, as if she had seen countless hopefuls leave through those doors, their fates uncertain, their dreams hanging by a thread. As Mark reached the elevator, he finally allowed himself to take a deep breath. His hands, still trembling slightly, fumbled with the buttons on his jacket, loosening it in an attempt to relieve the tension that had been gripping his chest. He could still feel the necklace pressed against his skin, a constant reminder of the weight he carried with him, not just in this interview but in life. His mother's voice echoed softly in his mind, that quiet reassurance she had always given him. "You're going to be fine. You can do this." The elevator doors opened, and he stepped inside, the walls reflecting the image of a man who was still coming to terms with the fact that his future was now in someone else's hands. As the elevator descended, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something had been off during the interview. There had been a moment, a strange flicker of recognition in Robert's eyes, when he had mentioned his mother. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but Mark had caught it. For a split second, the polished, stoic expression on Robert's face had faltered. His gaze had shifted to the necklace, the faintest glimmer of curiosity crossing his features before he quickly masked it with his usual professionalism. Mark hadn't had time to dwell on it during the interview, but now, as the events of the last hour began to sink in, that moment stuck with him. Why had Robert fixated on the necklace? Was it just an odd coincidence, or did it mean something more? Mark's instincts told him it wasn't random. But how could a simple gold necklace, one that had belonged to his mother, possibly hold any significance for a man like Robert Hensley? By the time the elevator reached the lobby, Mark had convinced himself that it was nothing, just nerves playing tricks on him. After all, people glanced at jewelry all the time without any deeper meaning behind it. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself that he had done his best in the interview and that the outcome was out of his control now. Still, as he stepped out into the crisp autumn air, the lingering unease gnawed at the back of his mind. The walk back to his apartment felt longer than usual, each step heavy with the weight of anticipation and doubt. The city buzzed around him, people rushing about their lives, oblivious to the storm brewing inside him. Cars honked, street vendors called out to passers-by, and the distant hum of construction filled the air. but Mark barely noticed any of it. His mind was consumed by a single thought: what happens now? As he reached his apartment building, Mark paused for a moment before entering. He looked up at the old, weathered brick facade, its cracks and imperfections mirroring the ones he felt inside. This place had been his home for years, a constant in a world that often felt unstable and uncertain. But it was more than just a building to him. It was a symbol of the life his mother had built for him, the sacrifices she had made to ensure he had a roof over his head, even when times were tough. Mark climbed the creaky stairs to his apartment, his feet dragging as exhaustion from the day finally began to catch up with him. The door creaked as he pushed it open, the familiar scent of home washing over him. Wood polish, old books, and the faintest hint of lavender, the same fragrance his mother used to wear. He tossed his briefcase onto the couch and collapsed into the worn armchair by the window, staring out at the cityscape. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the streets below, the golden light making the buildings glow in a way that was almost otherworldly. Mark closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the sun and the gentle hum of the city lull him into a momentary sense of calm. But that peace didn't last long. His thoughts kept circling back to the interview, to Robert's piercing gaze, and to the necklace. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. It was as if there was a puzzle he hadn't yet solved, a piece missing that would make everything clear. Unable to sit still any longer, Mark rose from the chair and crossed the room to where his mother's jewelry box sat on the shelf. He hesitated for a moment, his fingers hovering over the smooth, lacquered surface. He hadn't opened it since the morning of the interview, hadn't felt the need to look inside since he had slipped the necklace around his neck. But now, something compelled him to. Slowly, he lifted the lid, the hinges creaking softly as they revealed the contents within. The familiar pieces were all there. The delicate gold bracelets, the silver rings, the small brooches his mother had loved so much. And there, nestled among them, was a photograph. A black and white picture of his mother in her younger years, smiling at the camera, her eyes full of life and hope. Mark picked up the photo, his chest tightening as he looked at her. She had always been beautiful, with soft curls framing her face and a smile that could light up a room. But there was something else in the photo that caught his eye, something he hadn't noticed before. Around her neck, barely visible beneath the collar of her blouse, was the same necklace he now wore. His pulse quickened. The necklace had always been special to him, a family heirloom passed down through generations. But now, seeing it in this old photograph, it took on a new significance. His mother had worn it long before he was born, long before she had faced the hardships that would come later in life. It had been with her through everything. But why had Robert Hensley noticed it? What connection could there possibly be between him and this piece of jewelry? Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece together the puzzle. He needed answers, but he didn't know where to start. His mother had never mentioned anything about a connection to the Hensleys, or to anyone in the world of high finance for that matter. She had been a simple woman, content with the life she had built for them. But that didn't mean there wasn't something buried in the past, something she had kept hidden. As the evening wore on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important. He paced the room, his thoughts swirling like a storm, each new idea leading him further down a path of uncertainty. The necklace felt heavier around his neck, as if it held the key to everything but refused to reveal its secrets. Finally, unable to stand the suspense any longer, Mark made a decision. He would go back to Hensley and Company the next day, not for a follow-up on the interview, but to ask Robert directly about the necklace. It was a bold move, and probably a reckless one, but he couldn't let this nagging feeling continue to eat away at him. He needed to know if there was something more to the look Robert had given him, if the necklace held a significance he wasn't aware of. The next morning, Mark dressed quickly, his heart pounding with a mixture of nerves and determination. As he left his apartment, he could feel the necklace resting against his chest, a constant reminder of the questions that still lingered. The ride back to the towering glass building of Hensley and Company felt surreal, as if he were walking into a dream he couldn't quite control. The city rushed by outside the window of the bus, but Mark barely noticed the passing scenes. His mind was focused on one thing: getting answers. When he arrived at the building, the receptionist looked up in surprise as he approached the desk. Mr. Collins, she said, her brow furrowing slightly. I don't believe you have an appointment today. I don't, Mark admitted, his voice steady despite the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. But I need to speak with Mr. Hensley. It's about something important. The receptionist hesitated, clearly unsure whether to allow him access without a scheduled meeting. But after a moment, she nodded, picking up the phone and dialing an extension. I'll see if he's available, she said. Mark waited, his fingers drumming lightly against his leg as the seconds ticked by. Finally, the receptionist looked up at him, her expression unreadable. Mr. Hensley can see you now. Please, follow me. She led him back down the familiar hallway, the same one he had walked the day before. Mark's heart raced as they approached the glass door to Robert's office, the tension building with each step. When they reached the door, the receptionist gave him a brief nod before turning and walking away. Mark stood there for a moment, staring at the polished glass surface, his reflection staring back at him. This was it. Whatever happened next would change everything. Taking a deep breath, he knocked on the door. "Come in," came Robert's voice from the other side. Mark pushed the door open, stepping inside the office. Robert was sitting behind his desk, his piercing gaze already fixed on Mark as if he had been expecting him. "Mr. Collins," Robert said slowly, his tone measured. "I wasn't expecting to see you again so soon. Is there something I can help you with?" Mark hesitated for a moment, but then the words spilled out before he could stop them. "It's about the necklace," he said, his voice steady but filled with urgency. "Yesterday, during the interview, you looked at it. You recognized it, didn't you?" For a split second, Robert's expression faltered again, just as it had during the interview. But then he recovered, his face returning to its usual calm, unreadable mask. "I don't know what you mean," Robert said, though there was a slight edge to his voice now, as if he was trying to maintain control of the situation. But Mark wasn't going to back down. He could feel the truth just beneath the surface, and he wasn't leaving until he got the answers he needed. "This necklace belonged to my mother," Mark continued, pulling the chain from beneath his shirt and holding the pendant in his hand. "It's been in our family for generations. But yesterday, when you saw it, I could tell you knew something. Please, just tell me the truth. What is it? What's the connection?" Robert's eyes flickered to the necklace, his jaw tightening ever so slightly. The silence between them was heavy, the air thick with unspoken tension. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Robert leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. "I didn't want to get into this," he said quietly, his voice lower than before. "But you're right. I do recognize that necklace." Mark's heart skipped a beat. He had been right all along. There was something more to this, something he had never known. "This necklace," Robert continued, his eyes fixed on the pendant, "belonged to someone I knew a long time ago. Someone important." Mark swallowed hard, his pulse racing. "Who?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert hesitated, his gaze distant as if he was remembering something from a long time ago. Finally, he spoke. "It belonged to your mother." Mark blinked, confusion washing over him. "But I know that. It was hers." Robert shook his head slowly. "No, Mark. It belonged to her before she became your mother. Before, everything changed." Mark's mind was spinning, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together but still not quite fitting. "What are you saying?" he asked, his voice trembling with a mixture of fear and curiosity. Robert leaned forward, his gaze intense as he looked directly into Mark's eyes. "Your mother and I, we knew each other. A long time ago, before she disappeared from my life. That necklace, it was a gift I gave her." Mark felt the ground shift beneath him, his entire world tilting on its axis. His mother had known Robert Hensley, and not just known him. They had been connected, somehow, in a way he had never imagined. "What happened?" Mark asked, his voice barely audible. "Why did she leave? Why didn't she ever tell me?" Robert's expression softened, a flicker of something almost like regret passing over his face. "It's a long story, Mark, one that I think you deserve to hear." And with that, the walls that had been built up around the truth for so many years began to crumble, revealing secrets that had been buried for far too long. The weight of Robert's revelation hung in the air, suffocating the space between him and Mark. Mark's heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to make sense of what he had just heard. His mind raced, trying to reconcile the image of his mother, the woman who had raised him alone with quiet strength, with this new story, a story of a secret past, of connections he had never known about. It was as if his entire life had been reframed. The foundation he had once known now cracked open, exposing a hidden layer beneath. Mark swallowed hard, his throat dry. "My mother knew you?" he repeated, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. Robert nodded, his expression somber. "Yes, she did. We were close a long time ago." Mark's pulse quickened. "How close?" he asked, his voice low but insistent. He had to know everything now. No more half-truths, no more secrets. Robert looked down at his hands for a moment before meeting Mark's gaze again. "Your mother and I, we were in love once." The words hit Mark like a punch to the gut. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment, the room seemed to tilt. His mother, the woman who had always been his entire world, had been in love with Robert Hensley, the same man who now sat across from him, a stranger and yet somehow deeply connected to his past. "But why didn't she ever tell me?" Mark demanded, his voice shaking with a mix of anger and confusion. "Why didn't she ever mention you? I knew everything about her. At least I thought I did." Robert sighed, leaning back in his chair as if the weight of the years was finally catching up to him. "There's a lot you don't know, Mark. Your mother, she left that part of her life behind. She had her reasons." Mark clenched his fists, frustration bubbling up inside him. "What reasons? Why would she hide this from me?" "From you?" Robert's expression hardened, a flicker of something dark passing over his face. "It wasn't just her decision," he said quietly. "There were circumstances, things that made it impossible for us to stay together." Mark's mind whirled, trying to grasp the full meaning of Robert's words. Circumstances? What could have been so powerful, so life-altering, that his mother had felt the need to walk away from everything, including a man she had once loved? "Tell me everything," Mark said, his voice firm. "I deserve to know the truth." Robert hesitated for a moment, as if weighing whether to continue, but then he nodded slowly. "You're right. You do deserve to know." He stood up and walked over to the large window behind his desk, staring out at the city skyline for a moment before turning back to Mark. His face was etched with a mixture of pain and regret, emotions that seemed foreign on the face of a man who was usually so composed, so in control. "It started over 20 years ago," Robert began, his voice low and steady. "I was young, ambitious, and completely in love with your mother. We met by chance, at a charity gala, of all places. She was different from anyone I had ever known. Strong, independent, with this incredible warmth and kindness that drew people to her. We fell for each other fast, and before I knew it, we were inseparable." Mark sat in stunned silence, listening as Robert painted a picture of a relationship that sounded almost too perfect, too ideal. He could hardly imagine his mother in that kind of world, attending high society events, mingling with the wealthy and powerful. It seemed so far removed from the life she had built for them, the modest apartment, the quiet nights spent reading or watching old movies together. But then, things changed, Robert continued, his voice growing heavier. "I came from a powerful family, Mark. The Hensleys were one of the wealthiest and most influential families in the city. My father, in particular, had big plans for me. Plans that didn't include marrying a woman like your mother." Mark's chest tightened. "What do you mean, a woman like her?" Robert sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She wasn't from our world. She didn't come from money or status. And my father, he cared about those things. To him, it was all about appearances, about maintaining the family legacy. He didn't approve of our relationship, and he made it very clear that if I stayed with her, I would lose everything." Mark's hands tightened into fists. He could feel the anger rising in him, the injustice of it all. How could someone have forced his mother out of Robert's life simply because she didn't fit into their mold? It was cruel, heartless. "And you went along with it," Mark said bitterly, unable to hide the edge in his voice. "You chose your family's money and power over her." Robert flinched at the accusation, but he didn't deny it. "I was young," he said softly. "I didn't know how to stand up to my father back then. He had control over everything, my career, my future. I thought I could fix things, that I could find a way for us to be together despite his objections." "But you didn't," Mark said coldly. "You let her go." Robert nodded, his expression pained. "I tried to fight for her, Mark. I really did. But my father's influence was too strong. He made sure that if I didn't end things with her, I would lose everything. The company, my inheritance, everything I had worked for." Mark stood up, his anger boiling over. "So you chose the company. You chose your father over the woman you loved." Robert didn't argue. He simply stood there, the weight of his past mistakes evident in his eyes. "Yes," he said quietly, "I did, and I've regretted it every day since." Mark turned away, pacing the room as he tried to process everything he had just heard. His mother had been forced to walk away from the man she loved because of his family's greed and obsession with power. And Robert had let it happen. He had chosen his own ambitions over the woman who had given him everything. "What happened to her?" Mark asked, his voice raw. "After you ended things, what happened to my mother?" Robert's gaze softened, a deep sadness settling into his features. "She left," he said simply. "Disappeared from my life completely. I tried to find her, to reach out, but she didn't want anything to do with me. She was heartbroken, and I don't blame her. I had failed her in the worst way possible." Mark felt a lump forming in his throat as he imagined the pain his mother must have gone through, being abandoned by the man she loved, forced to rebuild her life from scratch. He had always known she was strong, but now he realized just how much she had endured, how much she had kept hidden from him. "She never told me," Mark whispered, his voice trembling. "Not once." "She was protecting you," Robert said softly. "She wanted to give you a life free from all the complications of the past. She didn't want you to grow up knowing about the choices I made, or the world I came from." Mark shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. "But I had a right to know," he said, his voice cracking. "I had a right to know who my father was." The room fell silent. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of Mark's words hanging in the air like a storm cloud. Robert's eyes widened slightly, and for the first time since they had started this conversation, his calm, composed facade shattered. "Mark," Robert said slowly, his voice barely above a whisper, "what are you saying?" Mark's chest heaved with emotion, his heart pounding in his ears. "I'm saying, I think you're my father." Robert stared at him, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of his desk as if to steady himself. That's not possible," he said, but his voice wavered, betraying his uncertainty. Mark's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. The timing, the secrecy, the way his mother had always been so protective of her past. It all made sense now, in a way that it never had before. "She never told me who my father was," Mark said, his voice hoarse. "She always said it didn't matter, that he wasn't part of our lives. But now I understand why. It was you, wasn't it? You're my father." Robert's face was a mask of shock and disbelief. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The silence between them stretched on, heavy and suffocating, as both men grappled with the enormity of what had just been revealed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Robert took a shaky breath. "Mark, I don't know. I never knew. But if what you're saying is true..." Mark clenched his fists, his entire body trembling. He had spent his whole life wondering about the man who had abandoned him, the father who had never been there. And now, standing in front of him, was the man he had been searching for all along.